Good afternoon and welcome here to St Albans Cathedral, where we are delighted to be hosting this Speak Your Mind sixth form event when we're considering the issue of food in the environment, the food on your plate, and what we can do to make a difference to the environment. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Quintin McKellar, who is the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Hertfordshire and who has very kindly agreed to host this debate for us. So please do enjoy this afternoon and make sure that you take your opportunity to speak your mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I hope everyone heard Kevin and can hear me well across the video link. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our talk, which is the food on your plate, who pays the price? And of course, we will be needing to feed a population of about 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. And the price of that will be very high. There'll be a price in terms of the finance. Interestingly, the price of food has actually got cheaper in the last 20 years. It's about 20% cheaper than it was 20 years ago. But of course, there are other costs to the food that we eat. Environmental costs, both in terms of greenhouse gases, huge impact on water consumption, and of course, land degradation. And there's also the price for the livestock that we keep in terms of animal welfare. And I'm sure our speakers today will comment on each of these. Before I turn to the speakers, let me just say that we have a fabulous range of schools attending this afternoon. We've got the Samuel Ryder Academy, the St Francis School, St Dominic's School, Sir John Laws School, St Albans Girls' School, the Beaumont School, the Arc John Keats Academy, St Albans High School, Parmeters, Reach Free School, and St George's. So welcome to all of you. It's a real pleasure to be hosting you here at the university for this talk and of course through the cathedral. We've got a fabulous lineup of speakers. I'll introduce them in some more detail when I turn to each of them, but the speakers today include Patrick Holden, Donna Mcgregor, and Joseph Powell, and we'll turn to each of these in turn. We had also hoped to have William Kendall with us, but he's unfortunately unable to come, but he has sent a video, and we're going to play that video first before we turn to the individual speakers. So over to the video now to hear what William has to say.
Over the next 30 years, Earth will have more than 2 billion more mouths to feed. Up until now, farmers have kept pace with growing demand. Higher yielding crop varieties, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and the plough have all helped produce record quantities of food. But our industrial farming methods have come at a cost, damaging our soils, contributing to climate change, and destroying the natural world around us. So much so that how to produce more food using fewer resources is one of the biggest challenges we face today. But farmers and scientists are working hard to find answers, exploring different methods of agriculture that can bring soils back to life, developing new technologies to maximize efficiency, employing robots that treat the needs of individual plants rather than whole fields, searching for alternative sources of protein like insects, and even growing meat in a laboratory rather than a field. Find out more at a special screening of The Future of Food, a series of 5 short films commissioned by the Aldeburgh Food and Drink Festival.
Well, that's a fabulous start from the video. Can I just ask all of you who are attending, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat, and we'll turn to these questions either after the individual speaker or at the end. We have a chat session at the end where we can discuss these. I'll ask the individual speakers the questions. If you want to ask a particular speaker, please indicate which speaker it is that you'd like to ask at that point, and I'll direct the question accordingly. I'm now going to turn to Patrick Holden, who's kicking us off. And Patrick is the founding director, or was the founding director and chief executive of the Sustainable Food Trust. He is the founding director. He was the founding chairman of British Organic Farmers in 1982, and he also worked for the Soil Association for 20 years. So we're going to get a great start from Patrick. Patrick, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Just a quick question. How long have I got?
You've got between 10 and 15 minutes to speak, and then depending on how long you take, 10 and 15 minutes for questions.
Okay. Well, maybe you could just say when I've been going on for 10 minutes, and then I'll moderate what I say. Apologies for speaking to you all from a car. I've been in Edinburgh at the Countdown to COP26 TED event with about 800 people from all over the world. I expect some of you have watched TED Talks, and I was a participant at that event. But interestingly enough, yesterday, there was the chief executive of Shell who gave one of the talks. And there was a young Glaswegian woman called Lauren who was on the platform with him, brought on to challenge Shell's position on fossil fuels. And she had a very strong and emotional outburst. I guess she's around 20, 21 years old, something like that, and walked off the stage. And at the same moment, there was a huge demonstration outside the big complex where these TED events were being held. And it was quite a moment. I mean, nobody quite knew how to respond. She was very emotional. She was very strong, and I thought quite courageous, if I'm honest, saying, you know, it's irresponsible of the fossil fuel companies to continue to strip the gas and the oil out of the Earth's crust at a time when we are right on the threshold of irreversible climate change. And I can imagine that many of you watching this will have your own concerns about whether you're inheriting a planet from the binge generation, of which I am one, arguably, who kind of dined out on the planet's resources and brought it right to the edge of being an inhabitable world. And I'm worried, of course. I'm a farmer. I farm in Wales. I've got the longest established organic dairy farm in Wales, and we have 80 milking cows, the milk from which goes to make cheese. But I actually, and it's very interesting to be on a landscape for a long time, in my case, 48 years now, looking at the impact of your farming practices on the outcomes, on soil, on nature, on wildlife, which can coexist with a farming system if it's done properly, as William Kendall just described. But the question is, what kind of farming systems could feed not only 9 billion people, but maybe up to 11 billion people, whatever the total is, and do so in a way which avoids irreversible climate change, restores the balance of nature, and produces enough vital health-promoting food to keep the population of planet Earth healthy. And that is a debate which is raging at the moment. And many of you may have seen Sir David Attenborough supporting the UK Climate Change Committee's proposal that the best way to do that is to fence off a third of all the agricultural land and rewild it to give it back to nature, and then produce more intensively on the remaining land and switch to a vegetarian or a vegan diet, or certainly a plant-based diet. And I was invited up to the Edinburgh TED Talks, and I shall be going on to the COP26 events at the beginning of November to challenge that orthodoxy, because I'm convinced from my own practice over many years and what I've studied about farming, the practice of farming, that actually sustainable intensification, in other words, more but responsible use of chemicals on the best land and turning back the rest to nature, is not the best way ahead. And interestingly enough, the TED event, all the food was vegan. So this is 800 people from all over the world, and all the food they had was vegan. And as a dairy farmer, obviously you'd expect me to find that slightly uncomfortable, because I farm 300 acres in Wales. 50% of it is permanent grassland. It's too fragile and steep or wet or boggy or something to be able to grow crops at all. And the other 150 acres is in a 7-year rotation, 5 years of which is grass and only 2 years of which is crops. And we grow oats and peas, and we used to grow vegetables, but in a sustainable rotation, which is what we practice because we've never used any chemicals in 48 years, you actually need to go back to a rotation to build for soil fertility, after which then you can have a cropping phase, which is ploughing the fields and scattering, growing grains or vegetables or whatever you want to grow. But that's the only way that you can farm in harmony with nature. And if you were all to come to my farm, and I'm sure I haven't got some pictures of it, you would see but you can follow us actually. If you're Instagram people, you can follow us on Havod Cheese, that's H-A-F-O-D cheese. And you'll see some amazing pictures of our farming system, farming in harmony with nature. And you might say, the next question would be, well, that's all very well, it's very nice, but I was a back to the lander actually. I'm a Londoner, I got back to the land during the 70s. I was one of these hippie back to the landers. You might say, well, that's all very nice for you to practice that rather ideal system of farming with a day job, but can it pay? And will it produce enough food if we scaled it up to feed the world? And really, is the sort of system that you're preaching at us today realistic, and could it go to scale? Well, those are, I believe, the key questions of our time. I hope that all of you are asking this question: what should I eat to be part of the solution in addressing climate change, to help restoring nature, and to be healthy? And how can we apply that system, not just in the United Kingdom, but right across the world? And can we do that within the next 20 years so that we avoid this 1.5 degree tipping point by the year 2050? And of course, that's what all the global leaders will be addressing at the COP26. But if I'm absolutely honest with you, I think many of them have got it wrong about the strategy that they're going to be promoting. So I mentioned Sir David Attenborough. The UK Climate Change Committee are not factoring in any of the sort of farming that I'm telling you about now in their calculations. Now, why is that? I think it's because of their nervousness about the capacity of the system that I'm telling you about to feed enough people. So what we are doing in my organization, the Sustainable Food Trust, is we've commissioned a study, and we've taken the whole of the United Kingdom land area, and as a desk study, we've converted it to sustainable regenerative farming. You might call it organic farming, regenerative, agroecological. It doesn't really matter what term you use. What we're trying to do is to farm within the planetary boundaries, in harmony with nature, and avoid the use to the maximum extent possible of non-renewable and polluting inputs. And we've applied 6 different farming systems to the United Kingdom, because obviously the top of the Scottish mountain is very different from the fertile lowlands of East Anglia. And you can produce more vegetables and grains in the fertile lowlands than you can on the high hills of Wales or Scotland. But we've then calculated that not only the yields of the crops and the livestock, which would be grazing on that land, but also we've totaled them up and divided them by 67 million, the population of the United Kingdom. And then with the results of that, we're going to be able to tell you what you would be able to eat if you made a personal commitment in relation to your staple foods, the foods that we can grow in this country, obviously not the tea, coffee, bananas, that sort of thing, but the foods that we could actually grow in this country. And you would know then what a daily allowance would be if you ate in harmony with the productivity of those farming systems. And the reason why that's so important is because there's not a farmer or a food company or a retailer, I'm talking now Nestle, Tesco's, all the farmers that I know, many of them are in big cooperatives, some of them farming very intensively. Not one of them is not aware of the climate change threat. And all of them are thinking, what are we going to do? And Nestle, one of the biggest food companies in the world, make a big announcement just a couple of weeks ago. They said, we are going to switch to regenerative farming. We don't even know what the route map looks like, but we have to do this because the situation is so perilous. And people like me, who've had the privilege of farming in harmony with nature for a long time, our views are being sought at the moment. So this report, when it's published, it's going to come up with some surprising conclusions. And I'll give you a taster of what they are. We will, if we switch to regenerative farming, produce a lot less grain, less than half what we produce at the moment. So it'll probably be about 40%, 45% of the total grain. And that's because of the rotations I just mentioned. You have to build fertility for half the time, even in the east of England or Scotland, where the soils are fertile. And you have lower yields because you don't use chemical nitrogen fertilizer and pesticides. But half the grain that's currently produced in the UK is fed to intensive chickens and pigs. So that means if we want to eat in harmony with a sustainably farmed Britain, we'll have to give up cheap chicken. And you probably thought, or may have thought, that actually chicken is the least worst meat to eat. Everybody's been told that they should feel guilty about eating meat these days. But they think that probably chicken's the one that's the least bad for the environment. In fact, it's the worst because it's fed on grains that are grown the other side of the planet in a very unsustainable way. And we can obviously eat more vegetables because we can grow more vegetables, and they ought to be grown as part of the crop rotation that I mentioned earlier. But here's the surprising bit. You've probably also been told that we ought to be giving up eating red meat, and that means meat from cows and sheep, and eat less dairy products. But our report is suggesting that because 70% of the agricultural area of the United Kingdom is currently in grass, and the ratio of the land in grass won't alter that much under a sustainably farmed Britain, and only ruminant animals, that means cows and sheep, can turn that grass into food that we can eat. Unless we eat that food, then all these worried farmers that I just mentioned won't be able to transition to regenerative systems because nobody will be there to buy their products. So if you want to eat a diet which is in line with the sustainable productivity of the future of this country, then it would consist of, yes, lots of vegetables in season, preferably grown by a farmer near to where you live, with a good sustainable story. A chicken as an occasional treat, which is what it was like when I was growing up. By the way, I grew up in Barnet and I had friends in St Albans, so I know your neck of the woods very well. We used to have chicken maybe once a month as a treat, and it would go back to that. But you'll be able to eat grass-fed and mainly grass-fed beef and lamb with a clear conscience, knowing that you're supporting the farmers that are going to transition to regenerative systems. And by the way, William Kendall is one of them. However, you might then say, well, this is all very well. You can challenge the science around which I'm speaking, of course, but wouldn't the price of food go up? And this is perhaps the key point of all, because we produced a report called The Hidden Costs of UK Food, published in 2017 and then refreshed in 2019. And you can download it from the Sustainable Food Trust website. And the headline of that report was that if you go into a UK supermarket, it doesn't matter which one it is, Aldi, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Waitrose, whatever, and you spend, £50 on food, it looks pretty cheap and affordable. And it is right that it's much cheaper than it used to be 20 years ago. But the hidden costs of that food, damage to climate change, water pollution, damage to public health, destruction of soil organic matter, destruction of biodiversity, if you even add the absolutely undisputed total of those costs up, you'll get to another pound. In other words, we are only paying half the true cost of food when we shop in supermarkets at the moment, if we do shop in supermarkets. That's what's got to change. So how would we change that? We need government action. We need the government to redirect the subsidies after Brexit so that we put them all into a carrot in the form of, if the farmers switch to sustainable methods, they get the money. If they don't get it. We need to make the polluter pays, apply the polluter pays principle. That means taxing nitrogen fertilizer and other inputs and practices which cause damage to the environment. And we need to harness the power of you, the consuming public, citizens, not just to buy regeneratively produced food, but also to use your votes to encourage governments to make the changes that I've been advocating. Now, at the COP26, our great Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will be leading the government and making these decisions. I don't have, if I'm absolutely honest with you, a vast amount of confidence that the government will show the leadership role, which they could have had at the COP26, to make the difference that is required. However, my experience of politicians is the main thing they want to do is to get re-elected. So if you use your citizen power to tell politicians that you want them to act on this before it's too late, and if you use your buying power to buy food with a sustainable production story, produced as near as possible to you where you live, at least in relation to the staples, and if we all did that, we are the powerful ones. We are the people that can avert irreversible climate change by our buying power. And don't forget that agriculture and food is responsible for 30% of total global emissions. So this isn't a small deal. This is as big as what we do with fossil fuels. And in some ways it's more important because agriculture, through the soil, which is the world's second largest carbon bank, is the only way that we can actually be carbon neutral, because we could draw down up to 100 parts of CO2 and put it back in the soil, but only if we switch, not just in the UK, but globally, to truly regenerative and sustainable farming systems. Now, if Sir David Attenborough was listening to this, I've met him a couple of times. He is a wonderful man. I hope he would be encouraged by what I've said, because even though he thinks that we have to farm more intensively to save nature, my suggestion is that he should come to my farm. You are all invited to visit my farm, and you will see food production in harmony with nature. And you will be amazed at the insects, the swallows, the bats, the other small mammals. We've got a black rabbit on our farm at the moment. All the wildlife which will coexist with a farming system which is generally producing food in harmony with nature. I suspect I've had my 15 minutes, so I'll shut up now.
Patrick, fabulous challenge to start with. We've got a first question from St John Law's School, and they point out that of the 30% of land that we have on Earth, 50% is already used as agricultural land. I presume this is taking in the seas and the forests and so on. They're saying that promoting veganism would increase that. I'd be interested in your comments.
No, I'm not saying that.
No, you're not saying. They're suggesting that veganism would increase the proportion of land which is used for agriculture. You might want to challenge that, but they then say that this would mean reducing biodiversity and species, so that not necessarily environment directly, but certainly biodiversity. I'll let you answer that to start with.
Well, here's a couple of points on this. A very large percentage of the agricultural land on planet Earth is not capable of growing crops. Either because the soils are challenging, like some of the soils on my farm, or because they're being degraded by intensive agriculture. So really those soils need to be healed. And a good way to heal soil is by growing grass on it. You don't have to graze it with ruminant animals, cows and sheep. You could just cut it and compost it. But growing crops is actually ecologically quite damaging and expensive. So then maybe that's what the person who wrote that chat meant. But the other thing about growing crops is if you just grow them year after year after year, which is what's been happening ever since I was young. I'm 71, by the way, and I started farming when I was 20. I got back to the land because I was a hippie. I was a long-haired hippie who joined a commune in West Wales. That was my story. I got out of London, so I'm a sort of urban refugee. And I hope some of you don't have to become hippies, but I hope some of you will consider a career in food production, because it's a wonderful thing to do, to work on the land. But the truth is that in order to grow vegetables, and I grew carrots for 26 years and I sold them to UK supermarkets, you need a crop rotation, which is about 7 years long, and you can only grow carrots once in that rotation. So actually even the vegetables that we're eating today are not grown in a very healthy way. So there's a lot to discuss there.
Patrick, they go on to ask about the impact of things like Brexit, and they suggest that the UK coming out of the EU means that we will directly trade with the United States. And they go on to say this suggests that we're going to get a better deal on our poultry, but of course that poultry is going to be, in their view, pumped with chemicals. And they say that that's going to increase the carbon footprint. You might want to comment on that.
I do. I think they're absolutely right. Chlorinated chicken, it was the thing that Michael Gove went on about when he was Secretary of State for DEFRA. What we need to avert irreversible climate change is a new global trade deal where the only kind of food and agricultural products which would be allowed to be traded between nations would be food which is regeneratively grown and climate friendly. And we can do that if we had a global harmonized framework for measuring farm sustainability and other projects that my organization will be taking to the COP26. We built a coalition of 50 organizations, including the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, NatWest Bank, Tesco's, Sainsbury's, and other supermarkets, all of whom realize that unless we measure the impact of our farming systems, we cannot have that kind of deal. So we don't want these grubby bilateral trade agreements. We just did one with Australia, which is kind of, political. We need a COP for food. We need a climate friendly trade and agriculture deal. And if all the nations on planet Earth agreed it, then it wouldn't matter if we imported some food from America, because the chlorinated chicken wouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, Patrick, I'm going to just slip in one last question. It's from H. Lewis, and he's asking the question, what's stopping people from buying cheaper imported grass-fed meat, including future American imports, after an agreed trade deal? I mean, it almost following on from your current...
It's a very good point. And to be honest with you, if we couldn't produce enough, and it was genuine stuff. I mean, I've been to some ranches in Australia which are producing fantastic grass-fed beef. If they can get it to us without undercutting our own farmers, and we need it, well and good. But actually, the great news about the UK is we've got, as I mentioned, a lot of grasslands. So we can probably produce not only enough grass-fed beef and lamb to feed us, we might even be able to export some. So this is not an anti-trade point I'm making. I'm simply saying that in terms of food security, a nation should protect itself by growing as great a percentage of its staple foods as is possible from its own resources. Otherwise, imagine the migration that's going to happen with climate change. What's going to keep people where they are? Food security. If you know you can buy food from near to where you live, you're not going to travel to the other side of the world. Great,
Patrick. Thank you very much. What a fabulous start. Now, I'm moving on straight away to Donna Mcgregor. Donna is a plant molecular geneticist. She did her PhD at the University of Chicago in the response of plant roots to drought. And she's now at the Rothamsted Institute, which is a fantastic institute that we have in Hertfordshire. So what a wonderful speaker to have. She now works on a weed called blackgrass, which is difficult to kill with herbicides. And we look forward to hearing, Donna, what you've got to say in your contribution. Over to you.
Great. Thank you. Am I able to share my screen? Would it be possible for you guys to give me that permission?
Yep, you have it now.
Super. Let me just quickly shift over. I just want to say, not all American imports are bad. Just saying, as an American import myself. But okay. So what I'm going to do is rearrange all of my things so that I can find everything all at once. Okay, so hi, I'm Donna Mcgregor, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is not all of the pictures that I'm showing you across the top here. These are some of the things that I do during my day job. But instead, what I'm going to talk to you is sort of a bigger picture about what we are doing at Rothamsted and what science is doing to try and make changes in the way in which food is grown and things are happening. So you asked me to talk about the food on your plate and who pays the price. So I wanted to start off with a picture of some food that was on my plate relatively recently. And during lockdown, I became quite interested in food, where to get it, how to get it home, how to store it, how to make sure we had access to everything, and really just making sure that I had different and interesting foods to eat, but also that it was nutritious and that I wasn't just eating pancakes with caramel sauce every single night, although that was lovely. But anyway, the food for me, this was a bit of a surprise because we'd gone from a situation where we had all of the food that we ever needed and it was all readily available to buying the very last bag of apples that ever existed in the entire world during the pandemic. And so this was a bit of a shock for all of us. And so major stressors like COVID-19 are capable of exposing the weak points in our food system resilience. They also highlight inequities within our food system. So I think they're actually important for us to learn from and to find the places that we need to fix and trying to identify the ways in which we can make things better. Now, COVID-19 was a major surprise for most of us because I've always lived in either North America or in Europe, where actually food insecurity is not something that we deal with on a regular basis. And so therefore, when we became food insecure, it was a huge surprise and we all had to react quite quickly. But as you can see from this chart, there's a lot of people in the world where food insecurity is not only something that they're much more familiar with, but it's something that is long lasting and really has severe problems. So if we're going to fix the food on our plate in the future, we need to kind of keep in mind, it's not just us, but the rest of the world is in this too. So agriculture really is the backbone of modern society. And we know this from the historical stories as well as what we know it's going on here. And I'm showing you a very nice picture from up at Rothamsted of a wheat field that's being very productive. But we know that actually agriculture is an incredibly complicated system. There's lots of inputs, there's lots of process, there's lots of things that happen once we've made the food. We have to then pass it on, it needs to be distributed, there's all sorts of demand and supply systems. So it's not quite as simple as it used to be of going out and eating the thing that you grew and then moving it on. For most of us, this is the process that we're going through, is we're engaging with the food system and we're partaking in the way in which it happens. And I was really surprised when I came to realize incredibly how complicated this process is. So we know that it's a complicated process and actually that it's something that's quite labor intensive. So here's a picture from Rothamsted again. This is a slightly different part of the same field where all we did was not spray herbicides on one section. And what you see is, yes, a very diverse population of different plants that are coming up. However, this isn't something that's going to be really, you're not going to be able to get a loaf of bread out of the section in the circle as you would be able to get out of the rest of the section. So we know that farming is intensive. We know that it requires lots of inputs. And actually, this is something that I'm working on in my own research, is trying to understand weediness and weedy traits. But again, I'm not here to talk to you about my work, but really just wanted to put into context of this is where my background is and what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to understand the genetics of weediness and why these weeds are surviving or not. But at any rate, back to agriculture and sort of the bigger picture. So we know that agriculture is complicated. I've established that. We know that it's labor intensive and we know that it requires a lot of inputs. But actually, even with all of that, we're not quite doing everything that we ought to be doing. So the calculations, these are getting old now, but I couldn't find any nice new figures. But really, the idea is that we're going to need more food really soon. So 2050 is not that far off anymore. And by then, we will need to have 60% more food. So we need to make some changes. We need to increase the way in which we are making food. For me, it's not something that I don't have a specific way in which I'm saying that we need to increase food, just that the fact is that we need to have more food. Okay, so going back to the idea of who's paying the price for the food on your plate, we need to start to consider how does that food get there. So again, I talked about this really complicated system. It's far too complicated to speak about today, but really even for anyone to think about in sort of so I'm going to take it apart. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down to seeds that grow into plants that get harvested for the trait that we need, and then the stuff that we harvest from those plants gets made into products. Those products are distributed and consumers can eat them. Okay, so this is the sort of circle that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to ignore all the other complexity and we're just going to focus on this part. So we at Rothamsted are an agricultural research station, and what we're working on is trying to understand this part of the process, right, from seeds to products. So this is the work that we're doing. And actually, this nice lady here, everything that she has in her sandwich is something that we're thinking about. How do you make it? How do you produce it? What's the process? So if you're interested in sort of more process things, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick some links in the chat over here. And we at Rothamsted have made a little short video about how science is tying to a variety of different foods. So if you're interested in that, tomorrow is World Food Day, and with the FAO and Sustainable Goals developments, Rothamsted is contributing to this and illustrating how our science is sort of contributing. So this is just a little link and a little plug for that. So I told you in the very beginning that I'm a molecular geneticist, I'm a weed molecular biologist. And so for me, it's this first half of that circle that's really the important bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just focus on this for the rest of my talk. I'm going to spread it out and just focus from seeds to harvest. Okay, so in the process of from seeds to harvest, you need to buy the seeds, you need to prepare the land, Those seeds need to be planted. They need to be taken care of with things like fertilizers or other inputs. They need to be protected, and I'm going to do a sort of a traditional farming setting rather than an organic one. So there's sprays and things that need to be added, stuff like preventing weeds and diseases and insects from eating the crop before it gets to a point where you can harvest it. But also there's water management. Sometimes it's too much, sometimes it's too little. We need to mitigate those challenges. Now, looking at this, you realize that there are many expensive inputs and that each of these stages we are paying into making that thing that we harvest. So many of these inputs actually have costs that are associated with them, either for things like petrol to drive the tractors or environmental effects that are leading to changes that we need to think about. So again, these are sort of coming back to those real costs of what it is that's creating it. And I just wanted to highlight the steps here that have major economic or environmental challenges that are associated with them. Okay. So as you can see, it's much of the process, and we know about some of these. And what I'm going to do is I'm focus on a few of them and try and break them down. So one of the things that I wanted to try and bring to you is that Rothamsted is doing research on how to make these things cost less. We're not trying to make them go away, but how can we understand what they really cost? And therefore, how can we reduce those costs by making changes? So I'm going to focus just on sprays and things that we add to try and control pests, weeds, and diseases. So the first thing that Rothamsted is doing is trying to make things more efficient. It is not very efficient to roll a square. It's much more efficient to push a ball. And if you can make your product into a ball rather than a square, then things make it a little bit easier. So increase the efficiency is really one of the things I wanted to start with. So focusing on cabbage stem flea beetle, which is a huge problem in the UK at the moment. It affects oilseed rape plants and it causes severe damage, so much so that many of the crops are just completely lost in the process of trying to grow oilseed rape. Now, one of the things that we are able to do is to utilize different farming practices to try and figure out what's going on and try to make things more efficient. So this is a picture of a field in which we have put an entire strip of wildflowers. Now, these wildflowers are natural places for enemies of cabbage stem flea beetle. So this is a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs inside of the cabbage stem flea beetle, killing it, and therefore preventing the cabbage stem flea beetle from undergoing reproduction and causing so much damage. So if you wanted to know a little bit more about this, then actually, what we're doing really here is finding ways to increase the beneficial insects that are controlling these pests. And so we can try and kill the pests and control the pests in different ways without using the chemistry, but instead changing the farming practices so that we bring these beneficials into the fields. Okay, so this was just one story. The next story is more about using things that are effective, right? So it's not particularly effective to turn a light switch on and off if the light bulb is broken. So we need to understand where the system is broken and how can we actually adapt that system so that we can fix the system or get around the fact that it is broken. So for instance, when it comes to weeds, you don't really want to be spraying the herbicide that's on the right-hand side on these plants because it's really not doing anything. These guys have all been sprayed and the ones on the right-hand side survived. It would be much better if you were going to use a spray to actually look at the ones on the left-hand side and use those sprays instead, because those are actually going to be efficient. So the idea here is to actually work through and try and understand what herbicide resistances are present. So therefore we can start to predict which are likely to work and which are unlikely to work so that you can inform the decisions that you are making in response to the fields that you have. Moving on again to the idea of altering the way in which things are controlled. So these sheep are not interacting with the sheep in the edges, right? So this is a different way of controlling sheep, and you can keep two populations of sheep separate. And it's also ways to keep them from eating that part of the grass, but this part of the grass. Now, this works really well in livestock because we can move things around, we can see them, but it's not so clear on how to do this with diseases. So I'm showing you here wheat ears that have been infected with a particular disease called fusarium. And fusarium is really horrible because it creates grain that you cannot eat and it's no longer reproductive. So what the research that we're doing here is trying to understand the interactions between the wheat and the pathogen so that we can better control the way in which they're interacting. So as you can see, the one on the top is just the normal thing. It wasn't actually infected. The one in the middle has been infected. It's completely devastated. But if you make specific changes in the way in which these things are interacting, if you control how that interaction is happening, then actually you can end up with more grain that's being produced, even in the presence of the disease. So what we're doing here is really finding the pathogen's ability, how it infects the wheat, interrupting this and allowing the wheat to mount a stronger defense. Okay. So I've talked to you a little bit today about some of the ways in which we are trying to make the interactions between the things that want our food instead of us, plants, pathogens, or sorry, weeds, pathogens, pests, and diseases, and how they're interrupting our ability to make efficient food. So the presence of weeds, pathogens, pests, and diseases mean that our food costs more. I've told you a tiny bit about these things. And really, what I haven't told you about is all the other projects that are happening at Rothamsted. So for instance, I talked to you how plants need nitrogen or additional fertilizers. We're working on understanding nitrogen use efficiency so that we can actually try to mitigate that the nitrogen that we are putting on is used really well and really effectively. We're working with water, understanding better the water that goes into and out of our farms, so that we can control where water is and make sure that the water that's coming off is nice and clean. We also do work on understanding soil depth and soil properties and soil characteristics, because when you do a full inversion plow, you're really mixing everything up. That's the point of it. But that's also not particularly good for the wildlife that's living in there. We know a lot about how earthworms are responding to plowing and that sort of thing. But there's lots of other beasties and different layers that are important in this in the sediment that I'm showing you here. And so if we can better understand how the different management practices are altering that, again, that's a different way that we can make this cost less. We're also working with understanding different types of plants. Some grow better than others, some are better under certain conditions than others. And so the seeds that you do plant, we want them to be efficient, effective, resilient, able to fight off all sorts of things, create lots of food, and make the best that we can. So we're understanding the plants themselves to try and make this better. Finally, we're also working with breeders. So we have a thing called the Breeders Toolkit, and we help to inform breeders to make the right decisions and about which genes and which genetic combinations and which backgrounds might be useful for the traits that they're looking for. So as you can see, we've got quite a lot of stuff going on here at Rothamsted. If you want to look at any more of these details, there's a link there to our news webpage, which you can then find out some more of the specifics from the links that I've just been telling you about.
Donna, thanks very much. I wonder if you could unshare the screen so that we can see you again.
Yeah, sorry, just a second. Only that the ending point that I wanted to make was that if you know the enemy and you know yourself, then you need not fear the result of 100 battles. So I'm a molecular geneticist. My particular enemy is blackgrass, but farmers are fighting battles constantly all over the UK, all over the world. And what we need to try and do is enable them to have the best knowledge, the best techniques, the best approaches in order to go forward. Because as somebody pointed out, yes, a lot of our land is actually already in agricultural use. And so can we make the uses that we have efficient, effective, and based on science and understanding rather than based on best guesses? So back to the food on your plate, who pays the price? Well, we all do. We need to understand the costs of the food that goes into it. We need to understand the complexity. We can determine where we can decrease these costs effectively and develop better practices that we can to make them better, because really we all pay the price. The end point is that all of us do actually pay the price because it is a closed system and we're all working together. Now I will try to unshare my screen. Sorry, wrong one.
Donna, while you're doing that, let me ask you a question of my own, and then I'll come on to the questions that have been put in the chat bar. Rothamsted had a target of achieving 20 tons per hectare for wheat, and that was a fairly ambitious target, given that the time that they set the target, I think it was something like an average of 9 tons per hectare was being achieved. How close are we to getting there, and do you think you will achieve that target?
There's some really amazing work that's happening all over Rothamsted in terms of making specific targets happen. In terms of that one specifically, I don't actually know, because I mean, it depends on whether or not there's weeds in the field, right? So these are all the sorts of elements that are coming into it. It's possible, right? Under perfect conditions, under perfect situations, with the perfect weather and all of that. Yes, of course we can obtain that goal. Whether it happens in reality, I'm not sure, because there's lots of complexity that comes into generating it. So for me, I can't actually answer exactly how close we are on it, but I can give you directions to the person that might be able to answer that better than me.
Okay, we've got a question from the Stag School. They're obviously interested in the data that you've given about utilising some insects in effect to try and remove the more pathogenic insects for your plants. And their question really is, how sustainable is that? And are there not likely to be unacceptable side effects of these insects, or might they do other things which are detrimental to the environment?
Well, the particular pathogen that I showed you, right? So this is a parasitic wasp that is native to the UK. It's something that we already know feeds on cabbage stem flea beetle. And the problem is that right now it just can't do it effectively, because if you have all of your habitat for the parasitic wasp on the outside of your field, and it can only fly so far, then it's only getting to the cabbage stem flea beetle that are immediately adjacent to the edges of the field. So the idea was to bring the habitat for the parasitic wasps right into the middle of the fields, spread it out, put it in different places. So the parasitic wasps just do what they do. They feed on the, they lay their eggs and they help to control the cabbage stem flea beetle. Anyway, this is a natural process. All we're doing is facilitating the access of the predator to its prey.
Wonderful. Now they've asked a second question, which relates to a Monsanto trial, which apparently has been happening in The Hague. I'm not familiar with which particular Monsanto trial they're referring to. Unless they can give us some more details, I suspect you won't be able to answer the question.
No, I'm not. I don't know exactly which question that's working on, but I mean, really what we are trying to do is we're trying to understand the fundamental questions of what do we change? How do we change it? What are its limitations? What are its benefits, right? These are the basic research questions that we ask. We are trying to understand, if you change this gene and it leads to increases in that protein, how does that change the development of the plant? What are the consequences of those functional relationships between genes and development, rather than, working on we want to know why, we want to know how, in terms of the actual trials and that sort of thing. That's stuff that, I mean, obviously this is something that I have no idea what's going on there, but however, the work that we're doing is really much more fundamental in which traits should be changed. If we could change them, what targets would you go after?
Yeah. Donna, let me ask you a final question. I mean, you're obviously working on intensified systems, and you're obviously thinking also about biological controls within those intensified systems. But Patrick gave what I thought was a quite plausible potential scenario for the future of the United Kingdom, basically looking at much more grassland management and reducing crop production and so on. What are your thoughts on his is that possible? Can we get the community to get behind a huge nationwide project like that, or do you think we're still going to need the intensified production systems that you're working on?
My role really isn't to predict the future. My role is kind of to understand how we've gotten to this point. So why do we have herbicide-resistant weeds? What have we done in the past that has led to a system in which we have herbicide-resistant weeds at such scale across our agro-ecosystem? So I look a little bit more historically than I do looking forward. I do know that our sister group down at North Wick, which is the second part of Rothamsted, is doing quite a lot in trying to understand the influences of grassland, particular types of grassland and grass swords on the effects of ruminants. So if you feed cows and sheep this group of grassing versus that group of grass, which leads to less methanogenic properties, will the cows create less methane if they eat this versus that? So the research that we're doing is feeding into that sorts of things as well, in terms of trying to understand, if we are going to have cows, what do we feed them? How do we make them the best possible cows that we can have, or sheep, or whatever it is? So I mean, that's part of our research, is that not to really, regardless of what choices the consumers make, how do we make the best possible product that has the least footprint with the best possible science?
Yeah, fantastic. And I thank you very much. We have to now move on. And our last speaker is Joseph Powell. Joseph is a PhD researcher. He's studying Rastafari theology, studying eco-theology, environmental worldviews, and responses to climate change. Joseph, we look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the introduction, Quentin. I'm just trying to share my screen. Someone can make me a co-host.
Yep, we're working on it. We'll get there.
There we go. Brilliant. That's the one. There we go. Fantastic. Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you very much for the intro again. And yes, thank you very much for having me at this event this afternoon, and to be alongside such esteemed speakers. Great privilege. So I'm going to be looking at things in from a slightly different angle, I suppose. As Quentin said in the introduction, I'm a PhD religious studies researcher at Cambridge, where my research primarily explores Rastafarian ecological spirituality and environmental worldviews. For this, I carried out some field work at the end of last year in St. Lucia, the Caribbean. Before this, my master's research was in a similar vein. I explored Rastafarian dietary practices with some fieldwork in Jamaica. And the start of next year, I'll be teaching a short course at your beautiful St. Albans Cathedral on the interaction between food and faith through a primarily Christian perspective. So it's great to be speaking at this event where I can connect both those research interests. So I'll be speaking more about my sort of research into Rastafarian spirituality later on. But to kick things off, I'm going to go through a few things which connect to a wider interest I have between the interaction between food and faith. You see on this billboard here, a rather historically questionable, in my view, image from Peter in America, who rather eye-catchingly given Jesus a halo made from an orange. As this billboard demonstrates, what is and what should be on our plates is something people of faith have been framing in different ways for millennia. And I'll be exploring 4 varying outlooks on this today. So firstly, in the context of my research, it's really important to note that the concept of the price of the food on our plate has changed so much in the course of human history through a religious lens. Whilst today I, and I imagine most of you, will hear that question and think about the environmental and economical price of the food appearing on our plate, for the early Christian thinkers, these considerations were vastly different. In the earliest days of the church, after Jesus' crucifixion, prominent figures like Peter and Paul were wrestling with the question of if there would be a moral price to pay if early Christians had food on their plate or engaged in eating behaviours that were forbidden under Jewish food laws called kashrut. Paul criticises Peter's apparent position of refusing to dine with non-Jews or Gentiles, something considered impermissible by the Jewish spiritual authorities of the time, the Pharisees. Peter himself is reported to have had a vision in which he witnesses a sheet of animals descend from the sky as he hears a voice from the heavens encouraging him to get up, kill, and eat. We can see a painting here which depicts that very moment. Peter receives this call in Acts 10. You can see there's a variety of animals in the sort of top of the image that he's instructed towards. And after protesting that he has never eaten anything that is profane or unclean, he is informed by God, what God has made clean, you must not call profane. Many since have considered this passage very historically important and representing a break with the Jewish food laws of the time. Now, the dominant position of the church soon aligned itself with this through the view that Jesus' coming had enacted a new or different covenant or agreement with humanity, and the church, which meant the Jewish food purity laws no longer applied. We can see such a view summed up quite neatly here in Mark 7:15. This notion that it's not outside pollutants which can defile humanity, but rather those in the hearts and the mind, like jealousy and anger. We are also offered an interpretation of this question of who pays the price for the food on our plate, which concerns itself far more with the food not on the plate, rather than the food which is actually on it. Towards the first few centuries of Christian development, we can see as the movement becomes increasingly urban, a growing number of people wanted to return, as they saw it, to a simpler life in more direct communion with God, away from the distractions of town and city life. These people were inspired by the example of John the Baptist. We can see a verse there from Matthew describing his apparent life. And he's depicted, as you can see from this passage, having lived a very harsh and simple life in the wilderness, eating only locusts and wild honey, which I'm not sure is a diet many nutritionists today would recommend. These people began to grow in number and are now known by the term anchorite in the modern scholarly descriptions of them. And they mainly occupy the desert regions around Egypt, praying all day and living off whatever small bits of food could be found or received by donation from any nearby townspeople. The idea in this was that the less dependent a person was on the physical sustenance, the more they could dedicate themselves to spiritual worship and to contemplation. So the more food you have on your plate of any kind, the greater the spiritual price you will be paying in your enslavement to eating and your enslavement to physical needs. So one of the first and perhaps most well-known amongst these early and Christian anchorites who were later named the Desert Fathers, was Antony or Antony the Great. We can see from here, the slide here, what his eating habits were said to be, which for me sounds even worse than locusts and wild honey. The same source, fellow monk Athanasius, reports that Antony lived apparently to the age of 105 though, so maybe there is something in it. There's many great stories from this era of diehard monks whose levels of righteous dedication was often visible through the food or not they were said to be consuming, which I'll show a few. Abba Theon, we are told, consumed only raw vegetables and shared his small water supply with animals around him. Ammon of Nitria is reported to have eaten a small quantity of wheat every 2 months. John the Hermit is perhaps the most pious of all the offerings, however. He's said to have survived purely on the bread he consumed at the Eucharist, quite literally surviving on the physical and spiritual body of Christ. My all-time favourite anchorite, however, has got to be Simeon Stylite, who went for the original David Blaine when he decided to live out the rest of his life of a further 30 years on a pillar in the Syrian desert, as we can see from this 6th century tablet, surviving only on parcels of flatbread and goat's milk that we passed up for a system of buckets and pulleys. As the anchorites grew in popularity, the desire and practical benefit of them linking together either formally or informally provided the foundation for the first monasteries, of which Antony is considered one of the founding fathers. Within these eating practices, the quantity, type, and frequency of food consumption became incredibly important, as it is amongst monastic communities today. To give you a demonstration of how central this was in early monastic communities, we have a great story about another desert father, Pachomius, who founded his own set of monasteries. One day, Pachomius goes to visit one of these monasteries, and as he nears it, a child runs out to him to tell him that no vegetables or lentils have been cooked in the monastery for the last 2 months. When he investigates why this is, a monk tells him that all his fellow monks have been fasting and eating the most minimal, like Antony or Simeon, and eating only olives and herbs. Given this inactivity, the monk has decided to spend his time weaving mats for use in the monastery and for sale. Now, if we're thinking ecologically, as of course we are today, perhaps we would think fantastic. The vegetables aren't required, so they aren't being cooked and then binned, wasting both fuel to cook with them and the food itself. Pachomius has quite a different take, however. Setting this monk up for a serious switch in mood, he instructs him to bring all of the mats outside and to be immediately thrown on the fire. We can see his reasoning outlined here on the slide. Are you not aware of what a glorious thing it is always to fast in this present life? The Lord greatly rewards anyone who, as far as he is able, fasts out of consideration for the love of God. But when he has no choice in the matter, but is compelled to it by necessity, his forced abstinence is useless, and he can expect a reward in vain. But when there is a variety of dishes placed in front of them, by partaking sparingly of them, they demonstrate that their whole hope is in God. If they don't see the food, if they are never given a chance of seeing it, how can they expect a reward from God for their abstinence? For the sake of a petty concern for the cost, the brothers ought not to be deprived of this opportunity. So for Pachomius, this monk has prevented his fellow monks from engaging in the true spirit of fasting, of rejecting food when it is present and not rejecting it through it simply not being there. For Pachomius, all of his monks pay a moral price when the food on their plate is not empty and sat in front of full communal plates with a great variety of dishes. Again, as we can see, this attitudes to this question have changed a great deal over time. Skipping forward 1,000 years and a bit to the present day, we look at this, the way we look at this question now is massively different, as the speakers before me have outlined. Many of us, as I alluded to earlier, would think about this question in environmental terms. In my own area of theology, however, the shift has been just as big. In the present, many church thinkers like the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, former Archbishop Rowan Williams, speak regularly about the concern the church and Christians should have for an entire food production system, which includes the people who produce the food, the area the food comes from, what makes up the food itself, including any animals, and the wider ecosystem which surrounds all of this and which is of course being damaged through emissions and global warming. Here is Rowan in a very grainy screenshot image firing shots at Western lifestyles as decadent and too concerned with maximizing the self away from the other. Focusing for today on the question of animals involved in our food processes, we see an answer to this question that says it is both animals and humanity that pays a price if we see animals on our plates. One of the most prominent modern theologians making this case is Andrew Lindsey, who you can see here looking very gentle with his pipe and his dog under his arm. Lindsey wrote a very influential book published in 1994 called Animal Theology, in which he makes a case for reassessing what he sees as a Christian view of animals, defined by animals being below humanity and existing to serve humans, grounded in the creation narrative in Genesis, the sense that Adam is the keeper of the Garden of Eden and has responsibility and in the view of some control over the creatures within it. Lindsey opens his book by saying that the idea that specifically animal creation should be the subject of honor and respect because it is created by God, however elementary that idea may now appear to us, is not one that has been given endorsement throughout centuries of Christian thought. So here he acknowledges again the journey that Christian views have been on, what what appears on our plates has shifted over time. Lindsey gives the fundamentals of this argument by presenting what he thinks is a bit of a shift and arguing that this world is not for humanity, but is instead for God as the creator, as a place to display his love for everything in creation. As we can see from the text here, he says, creation exists for its creator. Years of anthropocentrism have almost completely obscured this simple but fundamental point. What follows from this is that animals should not be seen simply as a means to human ends. The key to grasping this theology is the abandoning of the common but deeply erroneous view that animals exist in a wholly instrumental relationship to human beings. Even if humans are uniquely important in creation, it does not follow that everything in creation is made for us. Lindsey's argument lends itself not only to better care of and for animals, but also for the environment more broadly, care for the very stage which God displays his love for creation on. Finally, then, to touch on my own research a bit, I'll outline some Rastafari perspectives on this central question, which might be a bit new for some of you. Rastafari might offer an answer to this question, which says that every single being in the universe pays the price for whatever ends up on our plate. Many Rastafarians view the created universe as intricately connected from the very biggest down to the very smallest, with every single thing holding an element of divinity within it as handed down by the Almighty, or Jah. Through this view, Rastafari farmers I have researched amongst adopt a very carefully managed low intervention policy to agriculture, which regularly rejects any kind of fertilizer or pesticides, and many make an effort to communicate quite literally with the earth they're digging into during planting or harvesting. Many see that kind of agricultural process as the literal pouring of one's energy into the earth, and the kind of energy that you do put into the earth determines what you will get back and what you kind of yield you will receive. On a Rastafari farm I stayed on during some fieldwork in St. Lucia. I was given a guide on harvesting any plants for tea or the such like, which involved conversing with the plants and thanking them before any picking, which should take place ideally at night time when the plants are said to be sleeping. Through this worldview, anything that appears on our place is intimately connected to us and everything around us. Ecologically, this presents a view in which care and protection for the environment is quite literally and directly care for ourselves. Many Rastafari are passionate campaigners and advocates for the environment, and almost all of those I researched amongst follow a plant-based diet grounded in an environmental philosophy called ITAR. For many, this is a diet featuring only plants and avoids anything that's been processed or artificially enhanced or preserved, as you can see here on the board alongside some other points of info. Some also avoid salt completely, and I've also met some Rastafari who eat exclusively raw food, viewing it as more in line with God's original view for the earth as it is how it was created in its first form. And if you go to Jamaica or Caribbean restaurants in the UK even, you might see on a menu an ital stew, which is essentially just a big bowl of vegetables and spices. I would very much recommend. So I shall leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. Hope I've outlined a bit the journey, this concept of the price of the food that appears on our plates has been on in Christian thought and in religious thought more generally over time. And yeah, very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Joseph, thank you very much for that. Now, we do have one question, effectively theological question, which relates to, it's from the St. John Law School, and it relates to the 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 13, where Paul indicates that he'll not eat any flesh, lest he make my brother to offend. And I think the question is effectively, do you think this is because God wants everyone to be vegetarian, or was it simply because he didn't want to offend the guest that he had at the time? And what's the more general view?
Yes, yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, as I kind of alluded to earlier, there was a lot of considerations around in the early church, Peter and Paul, about dining, who to dine with, what to dine on, as a kind of fledgling movement, trying to break away from Judaism as we know it now. Yeah, it was a very central concern. So this kind of notion of not offending your hosts and kind of going about things in a respectable way, which also wouldn't draw too much attention to the early movement, was definitely very much consideration. From sort of my interpretation, I don't think there's much kind of in the early church movement you see in Corinthians and other places which kind of advocates a vegetarian diet as such. I think, yeah, as the kind of question puts it, it's more about, you know, not sticking out too much and kind of fitting in. But I think I think there's other verses which kind of lend themselves more to that. I mean, some of the Rastafari I research amongst are big sort of Bible scholars, and they point more to verses like those in Isaiah, where you see the visions of the lion laying down with the lamb, and, you know, all the animals kind of living off plants, living off hay, as a kind of idealized vision for creation, as a kind of vision of what creation used to be, before the fall and kind of in the original design for the world, and kind of what it should be going back to as well. So yeah, I think kind of verses like that for me lend themselves more to a sort of plant-based vegetarian diet.
Yeah, Joseph, one thing, you began your talk by giving several examples of individuals in the Bible and who had, in one way or another, very meager diets. They had very, I suppose they were semi-starving themselves. And we absolutely know from animal studies that if you do so, animals live longer. And indeed humans live longer as well, who have obviously people who are slim tend to live longer, I mean, on average, than people who are overweight. We've got a huge epidemic of obesity in the world just now. We've got an epidemic, of overweight people and diabetes and so on. I mean, do you think there's a philosophical or a theological message that we should be taking on board with regard to reducing what we eat and eating less, and perhaps living longer?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, yeah, so much of, I think this is, for me, a really interesting kind of counterpoint between Judaism and Christianity. You see this very strong focus in the early church on abstinence, like you say, and, sort of control of the self and denial of these sort of worldly pleasures. Or in Judaism, the sort of prevailing view then and now is that everything kind of God has put on the planet, aside from the stuff prohibited by Jewish food laws, are there for humanity's enjoyment, and it was placed there by God for us to enjoy. So yeah, that counterpoint between the two, I find really fascinating. I think there's definitely something in that. I mean, this kind of notion of intermittent fasting is becoming more popular, and I see people kind of looking for inspiration in this in kind of Eastern religious movements, which have fasting as a more sort of central part. And it's interesting to see how that's kind of really fallen away from Christianity. Even the sort of notion of abstaining from meat on Friday, which used to be very common even sort of 50, 60 years ago, is now completely fallen away. And I think that there's some people in the church that would be quite keen to bring that back and have more of a focus on abstinence instead of decadence. You see that in the Rowan Williams article I posted, and kind of more of a holistic view, I suppose, of health, very much like you say, and how much we are connected to all of these food structures.
Yeah.
Can I just comment on that?
Yeah, please, Patrick. I want to come back to something you said earlier anyway.
I just wanted to make a brief comment about fasting. I think fasting as part of spiritual practice is really interesting. And I think, there are sort of two answers to the question about fasting. One is to do with spiritual refinement. And of course, all the spiritual traditions have something about fasting. But I think there's also this, the 5-2 diets and all these diets, which include some fasting, they appear to alter the human metabolism in a positive way. So I think there are two things to explore there.
Yeah. Now, I want to come back to something that Patrick said in his talk. He very briefly skipped. No, I don't mean he skipped over it in a bad sense. He moved over it, which was about food waste. And we waste about 50% of the food that we grow. And there surely has to be a moral, if not a theological pressure on people to actually waste less. And I just wondered, Joseph, if you have any thoughts about that, firstly, do you agree with that, and how we might go about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that example from Pachomius, when I first came across that, I found absolutely fascinating. That notion that there kind of has to be waste for this sort of moral, uprightness to really sort of take place, and just how kind of crazy that sounds in our modern perceptions. But I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, so much of my work and field work amongst the Rastafari really has that as at its core, the notion of no waste, using absolutely everything as a kind of a means of devotion in itself, and a kind of means of recognizing the beauty and the divinity in everything that God has created. So absolutely, yeah, I think that's really much a point that needs emphasizing. And I think religion, which rightly gets criticized on a lot of this stuff, I think can be quite an important vehicle for driving home some of these messages.
Yeah. Great. Now I'm going to open the questioning up to the whole panel, but I want to come back to Donna, because she's been having a bit of a conversation in the chat bar with colleagues from some of the schools, particularly initiated by a question about herbicide resistance, and whether insects develop resistance the same way that bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics. So Dana, over to you on that. And then there was a secondary question, which was about whether herbicides actually have a deleterious effect on biodiversity, which you've also answered in the chat bar, but I think people would be interested perhaps to hear an expansion of both those things from your perspective.
Sure. All chemicals that are designed to kill a target, so whether that target is either weeds or bacteria or anything else, essentially what it is doing is it's killing pretty much everything. So if one survives and is able to create seeds or to create eggs, then whatever it had will get passed on to the next generation. Right, so you're creating an incredibly strong selective pressure that leads to a bottleneck effect, and then the populations that survive will have that enhanced resistance. And so the idea really, you know, whether or not herbicides are bad for biodiversity, that's kind of their point. Anything that's a biocide is intending to kill everything but the crop or the human or the thing that we're trying to save. And so we can't really think about herbicides and biodiversity in the same sort of sentence, because the point is to restrict the population. There was a little bit of a question there about mechanistic understanding about, is there a comparison, is there a parallel between the use of antibiotics and the use of herbicides that then lead to the generation of resistances? And the short answer is yes. If you, if we have a paper that's recently out that demonstrates that if you use a mixture of herbicides, then you will avoid specific mutations that lead to target site resistance, which is that there's one gene that evolves in response to overcome that one thing. Whereas if you use one selective pressure over and over and over again, of course, you're going to evolve selection that's going to avoid that, and it then comes out. So what some of the research that we're doing is trying to understand, is it better to have a whole bunch of mixtures that you use in rotation? Is it better to use one thing for a while? You know, how do you avoid generating different types of resistance? Unfortunately, what we've shown is that resistance is sort of inevitable, because if there's one that can survive its generation, you know, it can do okay. So what we're trying to understand is, how do you mitigate the chances that evolution is going to lead to something that can take over? So I talked a little bit in the chat about, you know, creating situations where you don't have a single dominant weed, you don't have just blackgrass, but actually you have a very diverse population of weeds that are competing against each other for niches, as well as the crop. So you create, you know, the flowering strips down the middle. So you've got a lot of stuff that's helping to control your cabbage stem flea beetles without relying only on the chemistry.
Brilliant. Now, Patrick, I don't know if you've just, yeah, you are still with us, great. I had a question, well, a couple of questions for you. The first related to your own farm. I was interested in your management system. Do you feed your dairy cattle grains, or are they purely herbage fed? What do you do with the male offspring? I mean, are they slaughtered? Are they used for food production? Are they used for meat production? Just give us a kind of thoughts on that. And then my second question really is this. I mean, it was a, you know, sort of fabulous landscape that you laid out before us of a United Kingdom that could actually feed itself in a sustainable way, you know, which would be a marvelous achievement. But my question is how you might get there. Of course, it would not be simple, and whether you would still need to have the intensification for periods of time. And even when you get to the point you suggested, might there still be a need for intensification in some aspects of agriculture? So firstly, about your own farm, and then the broader question.
Yes, well, there's several very important questions there. In relation to our own farm, what we're kind of trying to do is explore literally on an ongoing basis the question, how much food can a piece of land, in our case 300 acres in quite hilly West Wales, produce without, whilst at the same time minimizing, you know, we're not just a platform for producing food with outside inputs, whether they're fertilizers or grains. So in answer to your question, do we feed our dairy cows any grain? Yes, we do. You can get pasture-fed milk now, which is from cows which are fed no grain at all. But what we find is that it's quite hard to do that all the year round. It's possible some times of the year. So what we do is we grow our own. We grow a mixture of oats and peas as part of our rotation, and then we mill it into a kind of muesli every day, actually. So they get freshly milled oats and peas in their ration. But we feed far less grain than most dairy farmers do. And to your second question, what do we do with the male calves? What we are now doing is rearing them to about 11 or 12 months old as what we call ruby veal, which is like pink veal, obviously not in crates or anything like that, humanely reared, because obviously we want, and this goes back to the points about, you know, taking the life of an animal. It's a big deal to take the life of an animal, and we need to be respectful of them right up to and including the moment of their death. And then I think we need to eat them in a responsible way. So we are trying to cultivate an approach where all the food that we produce from our farm has a good story, including the welfare of the animals. And hopefully people will want to eat food from a farming system like ours. And by the way, on our own farm, that's how much food do we produce in a year? It's about 30 tons of cheese, maybe about 15-year-old veal calves, and then the dairy cows at the end of their lives. And we do produce some vegetables as well, and the odd pig which we fatten on the way from the cheese. But in relation to how we scale this up, that is the big question of our time. And I was just speaking to people from Nestle and also other food companies at the TED event. And even they don't know exactly how this is going to happen. And of course, there's going to be a transition. It's not going to be revolution, it's going to be evolution. And what we have to do is to redesign the food systems of the future together. And I think we need a lot of, you know, new local abattoirs and small scale processing plants for dairy and for meat, because I think a lot of the young people who are going vegan or vegetarian are doing so as a kind of protest vote. They don't like the fact that so many animals end their lives in great big industrial slaughterhouses in a not a very nice way after traveling hundreds of miles. And I think if we want to restore the faith of young people in proper livestock systems, we need to tell a better story. So that means for big companies like Nestle, like the big supermarkets, they need to change the way in which they get their food to us and have much more local systems.
Yeah, and do you think, sorry, Patrick, I'm coming back to you once more. I've got one for Dana next though, and then one for Joseph. But if I can just ask you a follow on, you know, we're hearing about a shortage of butchers just now. There's also a reduction in the numbers of local abattoirs that we see across the country. I mean, how might we stimulate? I mean, is it simply by paying more people more? How can we stimulate these more local, probably, I shouldn't say more ethical, because some of the larger abattoirs are clearly very ethical, but how do we stimulate small, local, ethical abattoirs to be sustainable?
Well, I think to your first point about the shortage of abattoir and meat processing workers, we've kind of delegated to an economic underclass of migrant workers the task of preparing much of the food we eat. And I think shame on us that we're doing that. So I hope that more young people will become involved in the future of agriculture. And if you're making cheese as we're doing, or processing the veal on the farm, it's really inspiring and meaningful work, actually. Whereas working in a huge anonymous industrial meat packing plant or a big supermarket, abattoir, which is slaughtering millions of animals for supermarkets, isn't very nice work. So I think we need to find a way to get a message to food companies that the meat we want in the future, whether it's a supermarket or whether it's, you know, a processed meat, mustn't any longer come from these horrible factories and abattoirs, and instead needs to be killed and processed somewhere near to where we live. And that's like a war effort. You know, we've got to put a lot of things in that aren't there at the moment. It will take time, but I think there's an appetite for it now.
Yeah. Now, Dana, there's a question about monocultures and the negative impact monocultures might have. The example that the questioner has given is reductions in bees and other insects, but of course we know that monocultures we know that the growth of potatoes to the exclusion of everything else caused the potato blight in Ireland. Same thing happens in various other monocultures. You might like to comment just about how we can grow these monocultures without damaging other populations important for pollination and so on.
Yeah, I mean, really, the example that I showed of the flowering strip right up the middle of the field is kind of the best example that I can use to illustrate how small changes can lead to big effects. So what that farmer did is they took one strip, and instead of planting the crop, what they did was they put a whole bunch of different wildflowers up that middle bit of the strip. What it meant was that not only the bees, the beneficials, the wasps that I showed you, pretty much everybody was able to live in that habitat and work their way outward. So if you can imagine, instead of having, just a huge block of monoculture, if you had the same amount of land, but it was broken up by these strips of different flowering wildflowers, then you end up with different agricultural breaks, right? So you bring the natural environment back into the middle of the field. What we showed was that from there, the beneficials hop out in both directions. You have an increased number of good beneficials that are going out into the crop, and you don't actually lose that much.
I was going to sort of ask this sort of supplementary, how much do you lose? I mean, how many of these strips do you need to kind of effectively control the beetles in a let's say a 50 hectare heap field? What would it be?
I mean, in all honesty, 50 hectares doesn't mean anything to me, but what I can say is that we have modelers who are working on understanding that exact problem. If you have a field of this distance, how many strips do you need per field? Where should they be positioned? Is a full strip right up the middle better than a couple of little patches here and there? So what we're doing is we're using statistics and we're using modeling to make those predictions. We know how far the beneficials are going from their habitat out into the field. And so we can actually make predictions of this is best for your field, and that would be best for their field, because we can understand how far the insects are going, where they're doing, what they're feeding on, that sort of thing.
Great. Now, Joseph, we've got a brilliant question in the chat bar, which relates to the very large percentage of the Earth's population who follow a faith or religion of one sort or another. But I guess the question is really saying those faiths or those religions haven't really done a great deal to persuade people to change their eating habits. What more could they do and should they do to make that happen?
Yeah, a very, very valid question, very, very pertinent one as well. Obviously, on the edge of COP26 as we are. Yeah, obviously, slightly disappointing that I think it's been said now the Pope won't be in attendance. I don't know if that's due to his health issues or a kind of a snub of some kind. But yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's crucial that faith leaders do more. I think it's perhaps something that's been neglected amidst the sort of climate debate more broadly. The power that faith can have. It's been put in very kind of secular terms mostly, I think, and there's a bit of a separation maybe between religious movements in some parts of the world and kind of ecological movements, but I think it's really one which necessitates dialogue. There was a meeting in the Vatican a couple of weeks ago, sort of pre-COP, as a gathering of faith leaders to try and build some kind of consensus and build some kind of unified message about climate. And from the list of groups I saw there was many that were kind of seemingly absent, or many that could have been there. I think for this message to kind of be conveyed through faith groups and to kind of build that support that I think is really crucial. It's going to take everyone speaking together, I think. So the broader that conversation can be, and more groups people can bring in, particularly indigenous spiritual groups, didn't seem like there was any of those amongst the list, then I think that it can be a very, very potent force for change.
Good. Now, I've got one question which I'm going to come on to. It's for you, Donna, in a second, which relates to the contamination of wildflowers. But before I'm going to give you each all a kind of minute warning, because I'm going to ask you to finish with, if in just one sentence you can say what you most hope for in terms of agriculture or food output or eating habits or what it might be, what would be the greatest thing in your view, each of you, which could happen, which would help alleviate the food crisis which we potentially face. But before we go to that, Dana, there's a question here which is about these wildflower strips and whether you actually have to use heavy herbicide use in collaboration with them. And I'm not sure if that's quite what you were suggesting, but over to you.
Yeah, so really to reinterpret your question, essentially, how do you keep those wildflower strips from spreading out into the field, right? So how do you make sure that they don't become encroaching into the field and the crops? There's a couple of different ways to do that. The first is to choose your wildflowers carefully, right? So you can make sure that you don't get stuff that is a weed or will become a weed, and you can manage that just like you manage volunteer crops, last year's crops, all of that process. You can understand what it is. You can also create permanent banks that the edge of the bank, just like the edge of the field, is a defined boundary, and you work within that edge of the field. So management options are the key, but you can also cut off the heads of the flowers before they set seed, right? So you can use those as ecosystem services rather than as regenerative seed banks. So you control it and you manage it like another crop, but you use it to provide the habitat for the beneficials rather than providing a crop that you then will harvest.
Great. Thank
I
you.
did put a link in the chat for that does link you out. There's a huge amount of information on this. We have the PhD student that was on this project was really active on Twitter as well. So there is quite a lot of information about this that's around, and there's a brand new grant that just came out. So there's a lot of good information out there about these flowering strips.
Great. Now let me come to each of you for your one great hope for the future. Patrick, you've disappeared from my screen, but if I can get yes, you're back now. Your one great hope in one sentence.
For each of us to use our citizen power, our buying power, to support the farmers to go on a transition to regenerative farming and food systems. We are the powerful ones. If everyone participating in this Zoom was to do that, we'd already be making a big difference. We'd be making we'd be addressing climate change, restoring nature, and making ourselves healthy and able to, and supporting the farmers who need our support at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Patrick. Donna.
I really do feel that knowledge is power. And by understanding the system to the point at which we can make a model that predicts that if you have a flowering strip here, it's going to lead to beneficials of that level. And if you plant this crop versus that one, understanding the system, we will then be able to design something that is going to be effective, that we will know where to do precision agriculture, and how to make sure that we are not giving too much. We're not just dumping on nitrogen, but we're giving the right amounts in the right places at the right time so that we can make sure that we aren't just being wasteful with our system.
Great. And Joseph?
Yeah, I think on a similar line to Patrick, I think the most kind of immediately achievable thing, maybe, and the most immediately impactful thing would be for big faith groups, the Church of England, big evangelical churches in America, the Vatican, to divest from fossil fuel companies, divest from these concerns that are making the environment more precarious and reducing the access to food and the condition of the food and condition of the foods around it. So I think that would be the most immediate thing to do. And like Patrick said, if people can petition people to do that, and if all the people here did that, then it would definitely start to make a difference.
That's fabulous. Now, can I conclude by begin my conclusion by thanking each of the speakers? What a fantastic panel you've been. What really interesting perspectives you've given us, and what fabulous answers to the questions which the attendees have raised. So, well done, everybody. Fantastic outcome. Can I just say, though, I've now been sort of had an interest. Incidentally, I didn't say at the outset, I actually keep 10 sheep myself. It's hardly a commercial flock, but they graze my paddock and I love looking at them. So I do have a bit of skin in the game, as it were. But let me just say, one of the things that has impressed me over the last 10 or 20 years, if I go back 20 years, there was a sort of almost war between the scientists who were developing genetically modified crops and who were looking at pesticides and insecticides in a holistic way and how they could be used effectively, and the organic movement, Patrick, which was very much against the use of anything. We've moved a long way. Both sides of the argument have come together. We're now looking at how we can embrace the knowledge, as Dana said, that we have of agricultural systems, and using it in a much more sustainable way. I mean, Dana talked about developing livestock which are no longer, or certainly which have much reduced environmental impact because of reductions in methane eructation and that sort of thing. Patrick, you spoke about those fantastic ideas about utilizing the grazing, the upland grazing, but actually also converting some of those crop areas into vegetable production and so on. Really, really interesting. And Joseph, absolutely, we've got to get everyone behind this, haven't we? And what better way to do it than through religion? Let's make it a religion in itself to improve our food production and to do it in a sustainable way. thank you all for such an interesting afternoon. It's been fascinating for me to hear you, and fascinating to hear the questions that have been raised by our broadly young viewers, I think, and I hope they've gained and have a better understanding of our production system as a consequence. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.